Well, breaking overnight, the execution of convicted murderer Doyle Hamm was called off and halted, according to Alabama Corrections Commissioner Jeff Dunn, out of an abundance of caution.
CBS 42 News reporter Jack Royer in Atmore following the struggle between the state and Doyle Hamm, who's been on death row for 30 years.
Minutes before the death warrant was set to expire at midnight, the execution of Doyle Hamm by the state of Alabama canceled, at least for now, with a death row inmate still alive and many asking what's next. A temporary stay issued by the U.S. Supreme Court would halt the 6 p.m. execution until just before 9 p.m. after hours more waiting for Hamm, his family, and attorneys.
After more than 3 decades on death row, Doyle Lee Hamm, a condemned inmate in Alabama, faced a tumultuous execution. It was a legal battle that spanned decades, culminating in a botched execution attempt lasting nearly 3 hours that drew international attention. In this video, we will explore every detail of this shocking case, from the horrific crime to the final fight for life. Due to the serious nature of the case, viewer discretion is advised. All descriptions are based on facts and are presented with care. On January 24, 1987, a tragedy struck at the Anderson Motel in Cullman, Alabama. Patrick Cunningham, a night clerk, was brutally murdered during a robbery. When discovered, Cunningham had been shot once in the temple with a .38 caliber pistol. This horrific murder quickly sent shockwaves through the small town, and authorities immediately began their investigation. $350 had been taken from the motel's cash register, along with $60 from the victim's wallet. The murder weapon was determined to have been stolen in another robbery committed by Doyle Lee Hamm in Mississippi earlier that day, indicating a string of crimes. The very next day, January 25, 1987, Hamm was arrested in Cullman and charged with capital murder. The crime scene left a tragic sight with clear evidence of an unforgivable act of violence. Investigators were faced with a brutal murder case, needing to quickly find the perpetrator and bring him to justice to soothe the community's pain. Patrick Cunningham, the victim of the murder, was a night clerk at the Anderson Motel. Information about Cunningham's personal life is not widely publicized, but one can imagine he was an ordinary working man trying to make a living by working the night shift at a motel. He was simply doing his job when he confronted a violent robber. Patrick's death not only took a life, but also left unending grief for his family and loved ones. He was just an innocent victim caught in the vortex of another's crime. His death is a painful reminder of the fragility of life and the brutal nature of criminal acts. The story of Patrick Cunningham, though lacking many details about his past, serves as a wake-up call to the inhumanity of the one who senselessly took his life, leaving an irreplaceable void in the hearts of those left behind. Doyle Lee Hamm, born on February 14, 1957, grew up in a poor family in northwestern Alabama. He was the 10th of 12 children. Hamm's childhood was anything but peaceful. His sister described it as hell on earth all the time. Hamm's father and 6 of his brothers had all served time in prison. Their father even told his children, "If you don't go out and steal, you're not a Hamm." Those words were deeply ingrained in Hamm's mind from a young age, shaping part of his outlook on life. From a young age, Hamm struggled in school. Tests showed that in the 5th grade, he was still reading at a first-grade level. Hamm dropped out of school in the 9th grade and began abusing drugs and alcohol. In his 20s, he was arrested and charged with robbery after a brawl in a bar parking lot. Although the victim later admitted that no robbery had occurred and Hamm's lawyer was not particularly diligent, he was still sentenced to 5 years in prison. Hamm was arrested several other times for burglary assault and grand larceny. A troubled childhood, a negative family environment, and substance abuse shaped a person who repeatedly committed crimes, leading to more dangerous behaviors later on. On January 24, 1987, Hamm's crime spree culminated in the robbery and murder at the Anderson Motel. After stealing a .38 caliber pistol in Mississippi, Hamm continued his crimes in Alabama. He broke into the motel and confronted Patrick Cunningham, the night clerk. It is unclear if any resistance occurred, but ultimately Hamm shot Cunningham once in the temple with the stolen gun. After murdering Patrick, Hamm took $350 from the cash register and $60 from the victim's wallet, a total of $410. This act shows that the primary motive was robbery. Two individuals who initially identified themselves as witnesses identified Hamm as the shooter, but they later recanted their statements. However, they subsequently agreed to testify as state witnesses. During his interrogation, Hamm confessed to the robbery. This was a cold, brutal murder. For a small amount of money, Doyle Lee Hamm took the life of an innocent person, leaving a deep scar on the community. Immediately after the murder of Patrick Cunningham, the Cullman police launched a swift investigation. The trail from the murder weapon, identified as stolen in another robbery committed by Hamm, led investigators to the suspect. On January 25th of 1987, just one day after the crime, Doyle Lee Hamm was arrested in Cullman. During the investigation, despite the initial recantation of two witnesses' statements, the evidence and Hamm's own confession to the robbery were enough to charge him. It was a swift and effective investigation, demonstrating the determination of the authorities to bring the perpetrator to light. Hamm's arrest brought initial relief to the community, but it was only the beginning of a legal battle that would last for decades, with endless debates about justice and the method of carrying out the death penalty. Doyle Lee Hamm's 1987 trial was divided into two phases. In the first phase, the jury decided whether Hamm was guilty. Then, if found guilty, the second phase was to decide the sentence, life imprisonment, or the death penalty. However, Hamm's defense was plagued with serious problems. His defense attorney spent a mere 19 minutes presenting mitigating evidence, omitting much crucial information. Medical and educational records showing that Hamm might have brain damage or an intellectual disability, including fetal alcohol syndrome and an IQ of 66, were not presented to the jury. This omission later became the basis for numerous appeals raising questions about the effectiveness of his legal counsel and a violation of the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution regarding the right to counsel. In 1999, a hearing was held to review the claim of ineffective assistance of counsel. However, once again, the process was controversial. A proposed memorandum order from the Alabama Attorney General's office was submitted on a Friday, and in less than one business day on the following Monday, the judge adopted this order into his ruling without changing a single word. 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Adalberto Jordan strongly criticized this action, stating it was impossible for the judge to have read all 89 pages of detailed documents in such a short time. He called it impossible, expressing his frustration with the process. Furthermore, the new lawyer appointed for Hamm at the 1999 hearing, despite objections from Hamm and law professor Bernard Harcourt, was unfamiliar with the case and called only a single witness, ignoring psychological experts who could have testified about Hamm's brain damage. These serious issues led a group of former judges and State Bar Association presidents to petition the U.S. Supreme Court to grant legal relief for Hamm, asserting that the legal process had been unfair. Despite all these controversies, Hamm was sentenced to death, a verdict that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In February 2014, while still awaiting his execution, Hamm was diagnosed with lymphatic and cranial cancer. His condition worsened in late 2017 with swollen lymph nodes and a cancerous lesion eating through his cheekbone. Although Hamm's lawyers warned that the cancer, combined with a history of intravenous drug use, made accessing a vein for the lethal injection extremely difficult, if not impossible, the Alabama Supreme Court set Hamm's execution date for February 22, 2018. United Nations human rights experts, Sister Helen Prejean, an anti-death penalty advocate, former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, and a group of former Alabama judges vehemently called for a stay of execution, fearing a cruel and inhumane execution. They warned that it could turn into an act of torture in the execution chamber. On the night of the execution, February 22, 2018, Doyle Lee Hamm refused a traditional last meal. There is no specific information about his final words at that time, perhaps because the event was so chaotic and unsuccessful. The U.S. Supreme Court had temporarily stayed the execution, but later lifted the stay. During the execution attempt, prison officials spent 2.5 hours trying to insert an IV line into Hamm's legs and ankles, and then his groin in an attempt to find a vein. Hamm was punctured multiple times with needles piercing his bladder and possibly his femoral artery. His urine was bloody for days afterward. A large amount of blood pooled around Hamm's groin, soaking through a pad. When the execution was finally called off around 11:30 p.m. because a vein could not be found, Hamm collapsed as he was being removed from the gurney. He became the fourth person in the United States since 1946 to walk out of an execution chamber alive. Major newspapers described the event as a ghastly procedure and torture in Alabama's execution chamber. Shausti, after the botched execution, Hamm and the state of Alabama reached a confidential settlement preventing a second execution attempt and effectively granting Hamm a life sentence. Doyle Lee Hamm remained in prison until his death from cancer-related complications in November 2021, ending a life full of tragedy and controversy. The death of Doyle Lee Hamm from cancer following a painful and failed execution attempt closed a long and controversial chapter in the history of the death penalty in Alabama. His case is not just a story of crime and punishment, but also a clear testament to the inherent problems within the criminal justice system, especially concerning capital punishment. This event highlighted deep concerns about the cruel and inhumane treatment of death row inmates, particularly those with serious health issues, and whether a punishment as severe as the death penalty should be applied in such cases. It also raised questions about the fairness of the trial process and the ability to provide effective defense for the accused when their basic rights are ignored. The case of Doyle Lee Hamm is a powerful reminder of the need to re-examine procedures and ensure that justice is not only served, but served in the most humane and fair way possible.